Hello guys, welcome to my recap of the game of round 4 between Nepomniachtchi and Firouzja. Nepomniachtchi is leading after 3 rounds with 2 points and Firouzja has 3 draws. So let's take a look at what happened in this game. Nepo as white played 1 e4 and Firouzja went into neither after these moves, and now Jan plays f3. e5, knight b3, bishop e6, bishop e3, and something similar happened in the game between Caruana and Duda. You can check it out. I'm not sure where it went differently. I think bishop e7 was played, queen d2, and then h5 was played by Duda. But here, Firouzja just castled. Jan went for a long castle, and now we have a very sharp battle. Knight d7, g4, b5, and now g5. And here usually black takes two paths. And the first one is when the knight goes to h5 immediately. And now knight d5 comes, takes, and then f5. And now black's idea is to just try to keep the king side closed as much as possible. And in case of capturing, there might be some pressure on the f-file on this f-pawn. And the second one, well, maybe the third one is 98, but I think that what Firouzja played in the game was one of the two best moves here. And after b4, the knight has to go to either a4 or to e2. b1 looks a bit clumsy because usually you want the king to get to b1, and the knight on b1 doesn't have any other options after that, so it's either a4 or e2. Or, God forbid, knight d5, which would resolve the issue of this knight. I think this is just good for black. If he goes to a4, then the knight goes to h5, and this is a very interesting pawn sacrifice. If white goes queen b4, well, it's not a pawn sacrifice actually, because you can always take on g5, but first black can go with d5, and after queen a5 just take on g5, and things become even more complicated after this. Also, he can avoid this complication with queen b4. He can go king b1, but now after a5, the knight on a4 looks a bit weird, and maybe that's why Nepomniachtchi didn't want to risk with such knight excursion on a4, and he went to e2. And now the knight goes to e8, and now f4, just trying to break this center, just in case of this, to capture back with the bishop and to get more space for his knights. So, understandably, black just keeps tension in the center, doesn't allow a good outpost for the knight, and he goes a5, just with his business. And now f5 by Nepomniachtchi. He saw that he cannot break the tension, but he can disturb the bishop. And here what's interesting is black can also take on b3, and in case of ab, a4 can be quite annoying, and the king doesn't feel that safe. But here cb is the best, and after a4 takes, rook takes, maybe b3 now is the best, because black also has some tricks. After king b1, black can take on a2, and in case of this, queen a8, and if king b1, queen e4, and black gets the rook back. And if king b3, there's also a trick with bishop g5, followed by knight c5. And the king would feel a bit too shaky in this case. So this was a possible option. Although, like I said, after bishop b3, cb, and all of this, b3 looks quite solid, and white should be okay here. So instead of this capture on b3, black went for bishop c4. Now king b1, freeing the c1 square for the knight. And now Alireza plays this, knight bc1, and finally d5. It's a very typical break in the Najdorf, but in this case, it's actually a pawn sacrifice. Usually what black wants is he wants to make this break without having to give a pawn, but in this case it's quite useful because it might bring the knight into the play with knight d6, opens up the bishop, and creates much more harmonious piece placement. Of course, here I will just give you one more line to just show you why d5 was so necessary. And if, for example, black plays queen a5, which is quite logical to defend the b4 pawn, and now white can offer a trade of bishops. And once you exchange these two bishops, the d5 square becomes much weaker. And also with the knight on g3, there's always an idea of f6 with knight f5. And that's quite annoying for black. So this is why black plays d5, just to not allow white to get this d5 square, at least to occupy it with his own pawn. And now Nepomniachtchi plays f6, the idea I was talking about moments ago. Now it is a takes, and now black's king feels a bit shaky at the moment. Also, you might have some ideas like knight g3, knight f5, which would be quite promising for white. So that's why Jan plays knight g3, and now the point is you cannot take on e4 like this, because you can at least go, well, first of all the bishop hangs on c4, but there's always some discovered attack with queen g2 and knight f5 coming next. But yeah, of course, the bishop on c4 would hang if you take on e4. And here Alireza takes on f1, which I don't think is the best. I think it's best to play this, to anticipate bishop c4 by knight c4, and to include one more piece in the play. But things are not so simple, because you can even take on c4 take and go queen e2. And black's position is full of holes. And I think his play is much simpler than black's play, because he can sort his rooks on the f-file or g-file, and knight f5 at some moment can be lethal. So after bishop f1, rook h f1, and here, if you take on e4 like this, now queen g2 can be quite annoying with knight f5 or knight takes e4, and I don't believe that black can hold this. Plus bishop h6 is always a very strong option, so let's say queen c7, bishop h6, and at least black is gonna lose the exchange on the next move. So after rook h f1, black tries to weaken the king, and he goes for a3. Now, understandably, Nepo doesn't want to capture on a3, just tries to keep his king closed, his queen side closed, and so his king, and now Alireza plays king h8, just tries to step aside from the g-file, and also tries to step from bishop h6, because if you play something like d4, let's say, then bishop h6 is quite strong, and in case of this, to cover the the rook, then white takes, knight f5, and after king h8 there is this move, and you don't have a good way to defend the checkmate. You can go here, but I think it just ends very badly after rook d3, rook h3, and h7 also hangs. So to just liberate this rook, he goes king h8, so he can meet this move by just rook g8. So white takes on d5. Now this pawn is for grabs. And I think here we can see the final mistake by black. He goes knight e6 now, which gives up the b4 pawn. But even here, it's not easy to suggest anything. If you try something like rook c8, then d6 is also very good. Or bishop g5. And then d6 is a very strong threat. If black tries to stop it by knight d6, now again b4 pawn hangs. So things are not simple for black in this case. For example, if queen b4, rook g8, you can take and put your knight to e4, and I think this is just a very good position for white. And I think this is what Alireza tried to avoid. But by avoiding this, he stepped into much bigger trouble. Also, just to mention here, if queen c7 is played, then there is a nice idea with rook f6 maybe. This and then d6. And the d pawn is just extremely strong. And it's tough to handle all of the weaknesses and weak king, weak pawns on the queen side. All that is quite tough to balance. But with knight e6, black has a very logical idea, but it simply doesn't work in this particular case. Now Nepo takes on b4, and probably here it was best to go rook b8 and to follow it up with rook d5 to at least somehow try to capture back the d5 pawn. That was kind of the last chance that Firouzja had, but also he was low on time, and it's tough to find moves in such a bad position. Plus, clockwise, he was not standing well either. And Nepo was like an hour up on the clock, so it's very, very unpleasant. He went for rook c8 here, and now Nepo plays a very nice move, bishop b6. The point of this move will be seen very, very soon. And now queen b7 is played, because if queen e8, there's rook f6, and white's gonna capture two pieces for a rook, and also with the king being naked, these pieces are gonna be very, very dangerous around the king. So Firouzja just avoided this and played queen d7, and now the point, queen e1, hitting the e5 pawn. And now to make things even worse, e4 is impossible because of bishop d4, and the bishop is very, very dangerous now. The bishop is pinning the king, knight h5 is coming, all sorts of attacks on the knight on f6 are coming, so e4 doesn't suffice. So Firouzja just plays bishop rook b8, and now bishop a5, trying to get to c3 and keep some pressure on the long diagonal. Now knight c4, and now d6. And now the point is to get the knight away and capture on e5. And this also looks very, very bad for black, because rook f6 might come, also rook d6. In case of rook b5, just go back to c3 and still keep your threats. And that's a very, very bad situation, like I told a billion times before. So that's why Black goes back to d8, and now Nepo doesn't exchange because he doesn't want to exchange a potentially good defensive piece. So he goes back to c3 and he makes sure that his king is safe. But there's not much difference between bishop d8 and bishop c3. It just keeps the bishop on d8 very bad, and the bishop on c3 is potentially a very good piece. Now Alireza tries with queen a6, now knight d3, knight d5, and now just an exchange of pieces. Knight f4, and the point here is if you take on c3, well, you take on c3 with the knight, and now the queen has to step from defending the c4 knight, and this means that black is gonna lose the knight, so it's impossible to do that. Black took on f4, rook f4, and now f6, trying to maintain this e5 pawn, but after queen e2, now the knight has to decide where to go. Probably it was best to take on d6, but even after that, bishop takes c5 is good enough to secure advantage. He went back to b2, tried to muddy the waters, but after rook df1, and now black tried to step from the pin by rook e8, but now rook h5 comes, and he's hinting that he wants stuff like queen e4 or queen h5. So Alireza tried to disturb this rook on h4, but now Nepo has a very nice combination. Rook takes h7, king takes h7, and now queen h5. Now if queen covers, then queen e8 decides the game quite easily, because all the pawns are gonna hang and the king is quite hopeless. Knight comes to f5, bishop takes on e5, and the king is simply helpless. So here, with 20 seconds on the clock, Firouzja chose to play king g8, but now after knight f5, rook g1 is coming with some checkmating threats. He tried bishop f6, but now after rook g1, black resigned, because after king f8, there's this check, and after king f7, rook g7. And if he goes to f8, this is the checkmate. And if he takes the rook, then queen takes g7 is checkmate as well. So after 4 rounds, Jan Nepomniachtchi remains the leader, and I think he's gonna be the sole leader because Fabiano Caruana is not gonna win this against Ding. Ding is playing for a win, but I don't think it's possible to win this rook endgame, which is currently on the live show. So that was it. It was a shorter recap, but I think that I covered as much as I could. So thank you so much for watching. See you soon, and see you in the next video. Bye.